Good afternoon, everybody. I'm totally confused. We're doing a hybrid lab now, at least that Gijs and I are, for the first time in a year, meeting in person. And I want to welcome you all for another online Hot Politics lab. And I'm very happy to introduce to you Elizabeth Connors, who is an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. And Elizabeth's work is of great interest to us because she studies phenomena that we are interested in, polarization, but she has an interesting and important take on this, also how social pressures can influence this. And some of her work has already appeared in prestigious outlets such as Public Opinion Quarterly, Journal of Experimental Political Science, I have to say this as a co-editor, and PSRM. Elizabeth will talk about some of her ongoing work now, and then afterwards we'll open the floor for Q&A. If you're new to the online seminar that we host, you can type your questions in the Q&A button, and then Gijs here will read out the questions and Elizabeth will answer them. So without further ado, Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Ta-da. Okay, does everyone see my slides? Okay, great. Okay, thank you for the introduction. I'm Elizabeth Connors. And today, I'm going to be presenting to you a project of mine that examines if effective polarization among the public is partly driven by social pressure. So in this research, I ask if partisans are encouraged to showcase their good partisanship by reporting positive feelings towards in-party members and negative feelings towards out-party members, what is known as affective polarization. Okay, so as we know, today's political culture is characterized by intense affective polarization. As Iyengar and Westwood aptly explain, partisans discriminate against opposing partisans, doing so to a degree that exceeds discrimination based on race. We also know that cultures and contexts can influence people's attitudes and behaviors, both real and reported, that to impress others or to fit in, people will morph themselves into what is socially desirable, or they will at least report doing so. Merging these two pieces of research, I argue that for those who are willing to associate with a political party, so partisans, reporting affective polarization or the measures that create the affective polarization construct is socially desirable. In other words, I argue that today's strong culture of political polarization can drive those who are both partisan and have the desire to impress others to acquiesce to social pressure and thus exaggerate reports of affective polarization. Now, before I get into how I test this argument, I need to clarify a couple of things. The first is that while there are various types of polarization, here I'm focusing on affective polarization among the public. Again, partisans reporting positive feelings towards in-party members wish to impress others will report political independence. But instead, I aim to add broader perspective to these findings, examining how these same self-presentation desires influence those who are ultimately willing to identify as partisan. So again, I'm talking about weak and strong partisans who likely receive social pressures from other partisans and want to be perceived as a good partisan. And in today's polarized climate, I argue that that means one who hates the other party but likes their own. So this leads to my main argument that among those willing to identify with a political party, weak and strong partisans, social pressure can inflate affective polarization, or that among partisans, reports of affective polarization are partly driven by social pressure. Okay, so how do I test this? Well, I run two survey experiments, the first aiming to test if partisans indeed perceive this partisan social pressure, or to see if this partisan social pressure exists in the first place. And then the second, seeing if I can change participants' perception of privacy and thus the sincere responses about affective polarization that they give. And then I also run observational analysis on nationally representative data from the 2008 ANES to see if I see the relationships I would expect to see in the real world. Okay, so let's first look at the first experiment run with a convenient sample on Prolific that tests if partisans perceive partisan social pressure to report affective polarization. Obviously, for partisan social pressure to be influencing self-reports of affective polarization, partisans first have to know that it exists. So to examine this, I rely on a previously used method that randomly assigns participants to be asked about either impressing or disappointing in partisans. So Republicans were told, please answer the following 2 questions as you think a Republican wanting to impress or disappoint other Republicans would, based on random assignment. And then Democrats were told, please answer the following 2 questions as you think a Democrat wanting to impress or disappoint, depending on random assignment, other Democrats would. Then all respondents were asked 2 feeling thermometer questions to measure affective polarization. And these questions asked respondents to place each group of partisans on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is the coldest rating and 100 is the warmest. Affective polarization, as you likely know, is then measured as a difference between feeling thermometers towards in-partisans and out-partisans, where greater numbers indicate greater polarization. So this measure is one of the most often used measures of affective polarization, but I also use additional measures in the other 2 sets of analyses. And the main idea here is that a gap between these impress and disappoint prompts will indicate that partisans perceive in-party pressures to report affective polarization. And this is exactly what I find. So respondents said that partisans wanting to impress in-partisans would report very high levels of affective polarization, about 61 on a scale from -100 to 100. And partisans wanting to disappoint in-partisans would report very low levels of polarization, about -46 on this same scale. So this difference is over half of the full scale, and it is obviously highly significant. It's also driven by both in-party and out-party feelings, and by both Democrats and Republicans, suggesting that for both sets of party members, people feel partisan social pressure to report high ratings of in-party members and low ratings of out-party members. So now that I know that partisans perceive this partisan social pressure, I next test if I can sort of relax this pressure by changing the level of privacy participants perceive, and thus the sincere responses that they give. I attempt to do this with another survey experiment, but this time run with NORC's Amerispeak nationally representative panel. And here again, I have affective polarization as the dependent variable, but now I measure it in 2 ways. Using the same feeling thermometer measure as in the previous analysis, as well as a trust measure, which uses respondents' reported trust in Democrats and Republicans to do what is right for the country. So like the feeling thermometers measure, this trust measure is coded as a difference between trust toward the in-party and trust toward the out-party, where greater numbers indicate greater affective polarization. As my independent variables, I utilize an individual level trait as well as random assignment to treatments. So first, I rely on self-monitoring, which measures individual variance in susceptibility to social pressure, where those who are highest in self-monitoring are those who are most likely to change their attitudes and behaviors to appease others or to fit in, and those lowest in self-monitoring are the least likely to do so. And second, I randomly assign participants to different levels of perceived privacy, where before answering the affective polarization questions, participants are either told nothing, the control condition, that the results based on your responses may be published, the public condition, or that your responses are completely private, the private condition. And the idea here is that if people's responses to the affective polarization questions are shaped by social pressure, then the sincerity of the responses should vary based on participants' perception of this privacy, where they will be more truthful or less shaped by social pressure in the private condition, and more shaped by social pressure and thus less truthful in the public condition. But importantly, this treatment effect should be moderated by the self-monitoring trait. We should see, for example, that a high self-monitor reports the highest levels of affective polarization in the public condition and the lowest in the private condition. And this should happen because social pressures are strongest in public settings and weakest in private settings, and because susceptibility to social pressure increases with higher levels of self-monitoring. So from the perspective of a high self-monitor, whose goal it is to fit in and to appease others, when there is social pressure to do something, this is what they will do. When that social pressure is relaxed, although it can't entirely be eliminated, this more performative reporting should be mitigated. So, given my dependent variables, I run OLS models with robust standard errors, with effective polarization measured in these two ways, as the dependent variables and an interaction between self-monitoring and the treatments as the independent variables. So first, I find largely null results of the public treatment and self-monitoring, but this makes sense if we think of partisans as being pre-treated to already report high levels of effective polarization. So they're already responding to social pressure and thus giving the highest effective polarization reports they're willing to give. And a public reminder treatment will not influence their reports because they are already driven by social pressure in the control condition. If this is the case, and my findings from the first study also suggest this is a case that people are pre-treated, we should see the real movement from the private treatment, where I attempt to mitigate social pressure and thus allow people, especially high self-monitors, to report more truthful or less tainted by social pressure reports of effective polarization. So let's next look at the results of the private treatment. And here I'm showing you the effect of the private treatment moderated by self-monitoring on both measures of effective polarization. And here we see a negative interaction, that as people become more susceptible to social pressure, or as self-monitoring increases, the private treatment increasingly allows them to depress the reported levels of effective polarization. In fact, while the marginal treatment effect of the private treatment for the lowest self-monitor is about a +7 on the feeling thermometer's measure, for the highest self-monitor, it is about a -19, a difference of over 26 points. In other words, when high self-monitors are told they have privacy and thus feel less social pressure to respond in a certain way, their reported levels of effective polarization are tempered. And this is notable given both pre-treatment and the fact that the treatment is simply a one-line reminder. So I run a few robustness checks on these results. First, I rerun analyses, adding controls, removing robust standard errors, and checking for linearity, and find that none of these robustness checks change the general results. Next, I check to see if the results remain for in-party and out-party feelings, as well as for Democrats and Republicans, and find that this is generally the case, although the results are a bit more robust for in-party feelings, more than out-party feelings, as well as for Democrats than for Republicans. I run a replication on mTurk, which was run actually previously for the test proposal, but I run this on mTurk and find the same general results. And lastly, I dig in deeper to partisan identity to see if this is more a story about social identity or, as I argue, about self-presentation desires. So I examine if the treatments were moderated by partisan strength and find that this is not the case for any of the treatments or the dependent variable measures. In other words, in exaggerating levels of effective polarization, it does not seem to matter how strong of a partisan one is, but it does matter how much one wants to impress others or to fit in. So this suggests that adhering to this partisan social pressure is motivated more by self-presentation desires than by the strength of one's partisan identity. Okay, so lastly, I conduct observational analyses of ANES data. Again, examining effective polarization as my dependent variable and self-monitoring as my independent variable. So if my argument is correct, that partisan social pressure drives reports of effective polarization, then as partisans' desire to fit in increases, or as people become higher self-monitors, they should report greater effective polarization, controlling for other important variables. Again, from the perspective of a high self-monitor whose goal it is to fit in, when there is social pressure to do something, this is what they will do. So if there is social pressure to report effective polarization, high self operationalize affective polarization in this set of analyses are the feeling thermometers measure from the previous two analyses, and a likes and dislikes measure, which uses respondents' reporting of likes and dislikes of the in-party and out-party. So using this set of questions, I created a binary variable that was coded as 1 when respondents report liking the in-party and disliking the out-party, and is coded 0 otherwise. So given the structure of the two dependent variable measures, I run OLS with robust standard errors on the first dependent variable measure, the feeling thermometers, and logit on the second, likes and dislikes. And I control for partisanship, ideology, ideological extremity, political interest, partisan strength, education, gender, age, income, race, and media consumption. And here's what I find. So these two figures are showing you the predicted effective polarization here and predicted probability of effective polarization here by levels of self-monitoring based on these two models. So on the left, effective polarization is measured with the feeling thermometers, and on the right, it is measured with likes and dislikes. And indeed, we see that self-monitoring is positively correlated with greater reporting of effective polarization. And again, I run various robustness checks on these results. Just like in the previous analysis, I change controls in both models, remove robust standard errors from the OLS model, and check for linearity. Then I again check to see if the results remain for in-party and out-party feelings, as well as for Democrats and Republicans, and find that this is generally the case, although the results again are a bit more robust for in-party feelings and for out-party feelings, as well as for Democrats more than Republicans. I then check if self-monitoring is simply predicting reporting likes and dislikes, or simply predicting complying with the survey, but instead find that self-monitoring only matters when the effective polarization measure is created. So none of these robustness checks diminish the general findings that one's willingness to alter their attitudes or behaviors to fit in, or their level of self-monitoring tendencies, predicts the reporting of effective polarization, which confirms what my argument would predict. Okay, so to put this all together, the results from two survey experiments and an analysis of observational data tell us a couple of things. First, they tell us that partisans indeed perceive social pressure to report effective polarization. This is what we saw with study 1 with responses from the impress and disappoint prompts. And second, they tell us that this social pressure is likely shifting responses, at least among high self-monitors. This is what we saw in studies 2 and 3, which use both this individual level trait, self-monitoring, to predict effective polarization reports, and random assignment to conditions that varied respondents' perception of privacy, and thus their sincerity of effective polarization responses. And we saw that these results remain virtually the same across 3 different measures of effective polarization, across experimental and observational data, for both Democrats and Republicans, and for both in-party and out-party feelings. And these findings are important beyond just the measurement of polarization, which on its own is important, given that people's perceptions of polarization can drive increased polarization. My findings suggest a dangerous snowball effect. The more people pretend to be polarized, the more the public thinks everyone is polarized, and the more people will pretend to be polarized. Thus, in some ways, it does not necessarily matter whether or not these reports are cheap talk. They have the same negative consequence. Also, though, my findings offer one way to alleviate reported polarization through increasing the perception of response privacy, as well as suggest a potential second way to do so. If it is indeed the case that people are exaggerating their levels of effective polarization to fit into a perceived polarized norm, then changing that perception, for example, reminding people that there is a large segment of Americans that aren't polarized, should tamper these responses. Of course, there is more to be done, perhaps the most important being how far this social pressure goes. Do high self-monitors over-report effective polarization in surveys, but then not follow through in their behavior? Or does this social pressure have the power to influence polarization behavior as well? Or for a more nuanced approach, does the social pressure only influence behavior in more social settings when social pressure is at its highest? For now, though, my findings should give us a bit more insight into what we are measuring when we measure effective polarization, as well as how self-presentation desires influence expressions of partisanship and ultimately politics. So that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Perfect timing as well. Impeccable. It's interesting you talk about privacy now that I'm actually sharing a room today with someone else. Yeah, it's a wholly new feeling for me.
He's paying more attention than normal.
Yeah. Okay, let's get to the question. And I already saw a question coming by, but it was actually in the chat box. So please, people, put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will read them out loud. But first, a question in the chat box from Kaming Chun. I'm a guest researcher from the Berlin Social Science Center, and I have a question for experiment 1. Is there a control group in this experiment? And I guess, what does it look like?
So there is no control group in that experiment. In some experiments, there just isn't like a natural control. So I'm asking people to respond, to say how a good Republican or Democrat would respond and how a bad Republican or Democrat would respond. Their responses on their own wouldn't necessarily be a control. It would be a measure of their own reported affective polarization. So just with that experiment, there's just no natural control, unfortunately. And that's just a product of the design.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Next question from Emily Thorson. This is so interesting. I'd love to hear you talk about how you see this as fitting with Klar and Krupnikov's work on independence, which suggests people feel social pressure, at least in some contexts, to report less partisanship rather than more. I wonder if the difference might be in-person versus online context. Would also be great to think about how this affects behavior on social media. Is it different across platforms, for example, Twitter versus Facebook, and or with anonymity?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I unfortunately couldn't necessarily look at this. I tried to look at it a bit in ANES, and it was just too crude to look at. So I think an experiment is necessary. My inclination is that the difference is sort of where you were raised, like how you were raised. So if you were raised to be either a leaning partisan or a full independent, perhaps that social pressure is really encouraging you to double down on that. If you're raised in a setting where your parents, your family, for example, is Democrats or Republicans, then that social pressure or that susceptibility to social pressure is encouraging you to act more partisan. And so I think there's probably two different sets of people, two different sets of social contexts going on. Whereas where the same person, the same high self-monitor, if you could theoretically place them in the world of the independents, would really exaggerate their level of independence and say, no, I do not associate with any party. I think partisan politics is stupid. But if you took that same person and theoretically placed them like at birth in the partisan social context, they would be the ones over-reporting their affective polarization. Obviously, I cannot do that experiment for multiple reasons. But I do think some future research should look at this to try to see how these social contexts are maybe predicting people in different settings, how they're reacting, how they're expressing their partisanship based on these self-presentation desires, and why it leads in some cases to more independence, and then in other cases to more partisanship. To answer a little bit of the other stuff, that's something I entirely want to look at some point, just how anonymity plays into this. We do know from other research that anonymous settings or online settings, people are more effectively polarized and rude to each other. So I could see that mattering, but this is all conjecture since I haven't actually looked at any of that.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth, for your answer, and thanks, Emily, for your question. Next question is from Isabella Rabasso, and she says, "Hi, Liz. Thanks a lot for this talk. This is really interesting work. You just hinted at this in your conclusion, but what do you expect the effects of partisan social pressure are on other measures? Are people less influenced when it comes to, for instance, discriminating against out-party members, or being unhappy if children married an out-party member?" And there's a second question from her, but let's first deal with this part.
Okay. Sorry, I have like Yeah, so I think so. At one point in the draft, I had said that perhaps this is suggesting polarization behavior because there's an INGAR piece that treats the likes and dislikes measure as quasi-behavioral. I don't really know that I'm not convinced that that's the case. And I think, as I hinted in my conclusion with my last suggestion, the more nuanced approach, that it's probably the case that they aren't following through on this polarization behavior unless they're in a context in which they feel that social pressure. So perhaps if they were in a context where they were surrounded by all of their in-partisans and everyone's talking about politics and how much, they're all Democrats, they're talking about how much Republicans are terrible, I could see them following through on that. But I don't think, my inclination is that it's not fully internalized, even though I did find this a fact with the likes and dislikes measure. I think with more social polarization, with the being happy, being unhappy if your child married an out party member, I kept meaning to add that to a survey because I was very curious to know that. But as it goes, designing surveys, you have to have trade-offs of what you can add. I'd assume it would follow the same trajectory if the idea is that people who want to impress others and are partisan are reporting disliking the out party because that's what they're supposed to do. I assume that would also translate into a more social realm where they're also saying, I not only dislike the other party, but I'd be unhappy if my child married an out partisan. But that's for future research. So unfortunately, that's again, just conjecture. But if my argument is correct, I think it should extend to social polarization.
Okay, then the second question is, could you elaborate a bit more on what it means that findings are more robust for Democrats than for Republicans? Are effects also generally stronger for Democrats?
Yes, so they are stronger for Democrats. So with the first study that looked at just perceiving partisan social pressure, the gap for Democrats, the gap between a good and a bad partisan was 108, and the gap for Republicans was 98. So difference of 10, but it's on a 200-point scale, so not crazy. But then I also found in the other two studies that the results were a bit more robust and a bit stronger for Democrats. So I talk about this in a draft of the paper a bit in the conclusion, but it could suggest that maybe Democrats are more like pre-treated. They obviously perceive this norm a little bit more, and they move more when I give them more privacy, which suggests that they were already reporting higher levels of polarization and they perhaps have more room to move. And then this would also reflect in the observational analysis where high self-monitoring Democrats are reporting more polarization than high self-monitoring Republicans. Unfortunately, I need to do this actually. I didn't check if any of these interactions are significant. But I will do that.
Okay, thanks. There's Emily Thorson with a follow-up, but you don't need to respond. But if you would, of course, you're welcome. Thanks for your response. The way I think about it is less about how you are raised and more about who people's default perceived audience is, which might, of course, be affected by how they're raised. Okay. Hence my comment about different platforms. We know from other research that people have very different perceptions about who their audience is on Twitter versus Facebook, what the social costs and benefit are of expression on those platforms.
Yeah, I know you said you don't need to respond, but that's a very good point. Yeah, and I thought you meant more about anonymous versus not anonymous settings, but yeah, I think perceived audience is huge. Would be thank you.
Following up on that, I was wondering whether actually region would be, or state where you were born in would be a relevant factor here. If you're, I don't know, a Republican born in an overwhelmingly Democratic area, an independent living in an overwhelmingly Republican area, you probably by default have different perceptions of how you should talk about your partisanship.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume if you're a Republican in a setting of all Republicans, you would follow the type of story that I gave. If you're maybe a Republican in a setting of all Democrats, which I think is sort of very rare, but in that theoretical scenario, I would think maybe you would go in the other direction. Not based on my argument, but more based on research that once you interact with people of the opposite party, you can tear down all the stereotypes you have of them, and you realize that they're just another person, you can find common ground, etc. But yeah, I think there's all these different social contexts and social settings that likely influence all of these expressions of partisanship that are a lot to get to that I think all needs to be researched.
Cool. And yeah, Emily says we should manipulate family history. Yeah, that would be that would be a super interesting experiment. Bit difficult, but yeah. Bert has a question.
Yeah. So thanks, Liz, for this talk. I was one thought. Whoa. What? This is this is Amsterdam Noord. The ghetto of no, it's a very nice neighborhood where Gijs lives. The question I have is in the ANES, what I was expecting is actually an interaction between self-monitoring and the mode in which the survey was conducted, sort of the face-to-face versus the online component. I don't know if the 2008 had that already, but I was thinking, to me, what would be the you sitting in front of somebody with these show cards versus the online environment? Is that not almost a manipulation of the extent to which you have some privacy or not?
So two things there. One, I did not look at the face-to-face versus online, but there actually is research to suggest that people can monitor themselves or give the good responses actually more online than face-to-face. Huh. So I didn't feel comfortable. I've read this somewhere, and I know a couple people have working papers that found this. And so I didn't feel comfortable doing that, but I did look at an interaction between the amount of discussions you have and self-monitoring, and found that discussions are, there's an interaction between the amount of discussions you have and self-monitoring, where discussions are effective at increasing polarization the higher a self-monitor you are, if that makes sense. So that's not perfect, but.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I wasn't aware of that line of work. And I should probably notice it, but can you speak a little bit more? Where does this self-monitoring trait fit within a broader range of psychological traits? So is this are the low self-monitors also people low on agreeableness who don't mind what other people think of? Are they actually the more emotionally stable than compared to the more neurotic? So where doesn't have to be per se big five, but where in sort of the domain of psychological traits, like what things correlate closely with it and what things are it really sort of independent of?
So Berinsky does look at this to make sure it is like its own trait rather than just encompassing other personality traits. But I can't, I should know that more off the top of my head, but I don't. There is a correlation with age that I find. I always just run a bunch of regressions every time I look at self-monitoring to see what it's correlated with, just to understand it more. And age is actually the biggest one that I come up with, where younger people are more high self-monitors than older people, which makes a lot of sense to me in many ways. Like, one, I think of people in high school, they seem like the highest self-monitors you could ever find. And then in college, maybe a little bit less so, but, and then it just, as you create your life, you might just care less about what people think about you, which I think we all could agree with. But yeah, I don't know. I know that it's distinct from something like agreeableness, but I don't know what the exact correlation is, or I unfortunately can't give you more info on that, but I can also look into it and send it to you.
No, that's great. And so in terms of self-monitoring, are there ways in which we could maybe manipulate or train people to be more or less self-monitoring in nature, in a sense of, you could think about this in terms of identification strategy, like we want to get causal control over the moderator, but given also that, you talk about the societal implications, there might be some normative um, beneficial conclusion to try to move people in certain directions.
Yeah, I could definitely see. I haven't done this, and at one point years ago, I really wanted to try to manipulate self-monitoring, but I haven't done that. But I could see. I think it would be hard to induce self-monitoring because, as I showed in the experiment, like they're already doing it. So trying to get low self-monitors too, I think might be hard. But you could maybe get high self-monitors to like calm down and stop caring so much about what other people think. Maybe just priming them about like the importance of research or the importance of anything other than your self-image. And I think that would be like pretty easy, because it might just be that high self-monitors their first instinct is to go into a social situation and try to figure out what they can say to impress other people and to look good. But once you give them just a brief reminder, like, hey, not all life is about, impressing others and looking good to others. These are some other important things that you might care about, especially in this particular context. I could definitely see that working. And that might be actually really important, because these high self-monitors are kind of making survey research a little bit more complicated. I like to use them because I get to study social context, but they lie all the time in surveys about many things. And so finding a way to get them to stop doing that might be very helpful.
Have you ever considered using something like a mindfulness training or induction?
No, but that would be really interesting. Yeah.
Isabella Rabasso has a question. She says, adding to this discussion, do you happen to know if self-monitoring is related to emotional regulation?
I don't, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
No.
But I also want to add that to my list, so I have answers.
Yeah, so there is a space to ask questions. Just please write them into the Q&A box, and we'll read out your question. I had a small, but I guess relevant question. If these self-monitors are a problem in our surveys, I was wondering how many are there?
Well, luckily, it is skewed a bit towards low self-monitors. So you could drop them, but I don't think people would like that. Yeah, so as long as they're not acting, I don't know. So this is future research that I want to do, is I want to look at their over-reports of what I think is their over-reports of voting, and they also, high self-monitors are more likely to say they discuss politics more and that they watch news more, et cetera, et cetera. Yet also, if you look at their knowledge, they're actually not more politically knowledgeable. So it suggests that they are lying. So I want to look at ways to decrease these over-reports, but also to understand how much they are moving surveys. So like there's the argument to be made that people aren't actually, or the argument that people have made that people aren't actually lying about voting, or they're not lying about watching news media. They're actually just misremembering, and they have, bad memory with that stuff. And so we can fix that by being more specific with the types of questions that we ask, like how many days a week do you watch the media or the news media? But if it's the case that people are lying just to say what they're supposed to say, then those things don't actually solve anything. And so in looking at this, I could see how much of a problem it is, how much of our mismeasurement for watching news, for example, is driven by high self-monitors trying to impress others. And then what's left over perhaps is the plus error, but is the people misremembering. Sorry, that was a bit tangential, but.
Good. What maybe taken away a little bit from self-monitoring to the first experiment, where I know if I interpret the graph there correctly, it were gigantic treatment effects with a super tiny manipulation. So what does this? Because you frame it in terms of indeed when we give with these primes we can move to. But what does this say about the validity of this sort of in and out party, liking, disliking. If a relatively simple, I'm not aware of a lot of sort of tiny prompts that move people on such central variables in American politics literature, but the affective polarization literature is traveling around the world, right? There's ample of European projects now on affective polarization in this context or in comparative settings. So what does this tell us about this feeling thermometer as a valid indicator of something?
Right. I think that's the big question. And I think that's probably why a lot of people keep publishing on it. Because there's a recent piece by Yif Laut and I forget who else is on it, but it is like, what are we measuring when we look at affective polarization? And there's, this isn't affective polarization, but this is social polarization, the POQ piece with Samara Carr and Yana Krupnikov and John Ryan that talks about these measures and how these are actually also measuring how much people don't like politics. And so I think we have these measures that we're using, and the news media is picking up on these a lot, talking about how much Republicans and Democrats hate each other, et cetera. So that these are such important measures that they're shaping like how the news media responds, and then the people that are watching the news are interpreting that and saying, oh, okay, Democrats and Republicans hate each other. And then hence my snowball effect, where then high self-monitors are saying, okay, I'm really supposed to, or Republicans are watching that and hearing, oh, Democrats hate Republicans, now I hate them back, which is, how people react. People don't like to hear that the other group doesn't like them, they'll dislike them back. And so I think, I don't think that affective polarization does not exist, and I don't think that it's meaningless at all, but I do think that we need a better way to measure, a more nuanced measure and understanding of it. I do think there are groups of Democrats and Republicans, and these are probably, in my experiment, the strong partisans seem to be the ones that don't move. The weak partisans are sort of moving around. The strong partisans probably are the ones that really do hate the other party. And there probably also are people who really don't like politics and they opt out. And they're the people in the Clark and Krupnikov book probably who are saying that I'm an independent because I think partisans are stupid. And then there are probably people that are over-reporting, like I'm arguing, to fit in with this polarized public. And so I think all of this research is great, like really great, because we're maybe trying to disentangle all the many things that are going on within these measures that we're using all the time, and that again, the news media is just picking up on and reporting.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, great, thanks. I have another question. I was thinking of the work of the sociologist Randall Collins about symbolic interactions, and one of his key claims is that we need physiological closeness to other people in order to be to have the same feelings when engaging in rituals. Now, politics might be seen as sort of the return of the rituals of the hunter-gatherer societies in many ways. And what I was struck with in your experiments is that in the privacy treatment, people, you don't actually use physiological presence as a treatment, right? Could you maybe discuss whether you think this, to have this actual person with you in a network would actually make a difference compared to so not just a neutral person who's interviewing you, but an actual person with whom you have a conversation.
And do you mean a person that's of the opposite party, or you just mean another person of the opposite party?
But you're both, yeah. Oh. Yeah. Would that affect your results compared to the survey results you've been?
Right. So that's interesting. That I'm just sorry, I kind of went on like a tangent in my head, because that does suggest that the findings recently, Lewandowski and Stekula have been looking at this, and then the Brookman and Kalla, all of the interactions that are supposed to like decrease, basically like increase tolerance, decrease affective polarization or exclusionary attitudes. could potentially just be by literally just being in the same room with someone. Like that could just be part of the treatment rather than the talking doesn't necessarily need to be happening. But I would think if someone were in the room with them, so if we think about a high self monitor, someone being in the room with them from the in party would probably, well, if you can increase these reports of affective polarization, would probably do so, right? Because that's like someone looking over your shoulder when you're writing something down and you make sure you're writing down the correct answers, or you're not writing down something like embarrassing. That's basically what that treatment would be doing. Someone of the opposite party might calm them down, like might, as we talked about before, like tell high self monitors, stop, like just give them a pause. Like you don't need to be trying to impress others right now, etc. So I could see that having that effect, if that answered your question. But I actually didn't know about that research in particular. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty old stuff and also not really experimentally investigated. So, but
oh, sorry.
Yeah, but the point he makes is that is that actually when people are in co-presence, there's sort of physiological syncing going on. So actually, people's heartbeats, for example, are syncing once you are in each other's presence. So it might indeed be the case that it's just presence. That could be an hypothesis. Yeah.
That has normally bad implications for like social polarization. So people, if Democrats and Republicans just aren't talking to, or aren't even in the same state or county or restaurants or et cetera, that would have some normative implications for that.
Yeah.
Could you use the dorm assignment, the classical dorm assignment, as a treatment for studying this?
I did want to. I had that on my to-do list. I've gotten like very overwhelmed with this project and then started way too many projects, and so it's been pushed back. But I have one. I think that would be like a very perfect test.
Yeah.
I'm clicking all the wrong buttons. There's a question from Isabella Rabasso again. Have you compared the means in the impress and disappoint conditions of your sample to, for instance, the means in the ANES data? Are people in the impress condition close or much higher to those in the ANES data? So are people usually trying to impress when answering surveys? Okay, yeah.
Yes, that is definitely what I would argue, but I can even look at my 2008, just the mean was 45 on the same scale. And I think I said the impress prompts was 60 something. So much closer. The impress prompts were much closer to the actual mean. Granted, this was in 2008, but actually polarization was less intense in 2008. So the mean has gone up since then. So definitely that's like another way of suggesting that people are typically trying to impress others in surveys. And the way to change it is saying, how do you disappoint other partisans?
That's interesting. I'm just thinking, would it actually matter for surveys? I mean, I assume for your surveys, the respondents were aware that you are from the University of South Carolina. I mean, would it matter if they were being interviewed by a clearly, I don't know, Republican university or a very pro-democratic university?
Yeah, I would think so. That would be interesting. I have thought about that just also with all the research about 2016 election and the 2020 election, with maybe Republicans just aren't taking our surveys. And then, maybe our surveys at least, are coming from universities, which a lot of Republicans associate with the Democratic Party. And so they're potentially maybe not wanting to talk to us or giving different answers based on that.
Yeah, I've it's a question. It's a broader question, but it might come with some sort of placebo test, in a sense that yeah, no, it might. We'll see. No, but what I was thinking about, how central is politics as an identity for people, if you can move people with these relative prompts. So they're basically doing a part of a signaling job. And so the placebo test would be, are there other feeling thermometers where people might do less of the sort of the difference in signaling? But I think the more fundamental question is, we might be studying an identity that we think is important, namely our political identity. But for I don't know 100%. I've spent some time in the United States, but at least if I look in the Netherlands, if I meet people at the schoolyard, it's not about politics, right? They have an identity as a husband or wife. You have a job. You live in a city, or you live in a neighborhood. So are there ways in which you could show that's back to the placebo test? It's like, where do the treatments, or where does the self-monitoring not matter? But it's a more fundamental question. It's like, how important then is this sort of affective polarization and the political identity in the larger scale of identities that people have?
Yeah, so I think, as you said, and actually Jana Kubnikov and John Ryan have a book coming out about this, that it's just a minority of people that actually care about politics. And I would think applying that to my findings would be, those people that really do care about politics are the strong partisans who aren't really moving by my treatments. The people who are moving from my treatments are the ones who don't really care about politics, and they're high self-monitors. So what they're doing is they're going into a survey or any social context, thinking about how to fit in and how to impress others. And that's just going to apply to the political measures. And so they're likely lying about how often they exercise, or what they eat, or how much TV they watch, and what kind of TV they watch. And then they're also lying about how much news they watch, and what they think about the out party. And so high self-monitors are just lying across the board. Politics is one segment in which they're lying. But they're probably people that don't care that much about politics because they're willing to lie about it. Do you know what I mean? Like, their priority is about impressing others, not about politics, or actually their in party versus out party.
Would there be any measure in your 2008? I think I like this response, this line of thinking. Would there be any measure in the 2008 ANES where you would say, well, that's where self-monitoring would have a weaker or not a statistically significant effect? Like, say, people, and it might be racism or so, right, which is maybe more, well, but I can guess there's sort of self-representational goals in racism, but
I would say it would have a weaker effect in harder issues that they don't know what the correct answer is. Yeah. And so it's not easy for them to go in. Like, the reason why I think I'm finding this an affective polarization is because it's being talked so much about, that most people, as I saw in study 1, most people know what the correct response is. And so high self-monitors are taking that correct response. If you give them a question where it's unclear what the correct response is, we would probably find no correlation of self-monitoring, because even if they were trying to impress others with their responses, they don't agree on what the correct response is, so that's just noise.
Okay, we're almost at the end. We have space for one more question, and then I want to end with sort of a big question. What's next? Where are you going to take these? What's the next step in these findings? What sort of research designs do you think are promising?
So basically one of two, and we've briefly talked about them. One would be the dorm design, and that would be data that I could collect. But another would be, and I think this might be the next way to go, is actually looking at this behavior and seeing if these reports are cheap talk, or if high self-monitors are also following through, and either following through in the behavior or internalizing it. Like an IAT could look at that. If high self-monitors reports of affective polarization go down in the IAT from the feeling thermometers, that might indicate that they're not internalizing it and that they're just reporting it. But also behavior would be interesting, because it would also suggest, if they are following through in this behavior, it would also suggest the implications of talking about polarization all the time for high self-monitors. if they're following through on this behavior and they're the people going to protest, et cetera, then you're really driving the public by telling the public that they are polarized. If they're just lying in surveys, that maybe narrows the scope of it and it matters more for surveys. Although again, I think it does matter because it's going into the news media and then people are hearing that people are polarized and then deciding that they also don't like the other party because they hear that the other party hates them. So I think behavior would be the next move.
Okay, thanks, Liz. We're almost at the end, and I want to take the opportunity to thank you for presenting this very interesting work. And we didn't talk about the scope of this, but I could obviously see self-monitoring being relevant in other contexts than just the US-based context, right? There are a lot of signaling in other countries as well, and so I think I really enjoyed it today. Want to thank you. I also want to take a minute to announce a couple of the upcoming speakers.
The coffee mug.
Oh right, yeah, we almost forgot. Yeah, we almost forgot we have them, but you will get a coffee mug. It's probably going to be MPSA 2022 or 2023 when we're vaccinated and allowed back in, but you will get one.
And this one is used quite a lot, so yours will be nicer. We'll actually say Hot Politics Lab rather than Ho Poll something.
So next week we'll meet again. Then we have it's the last Friday of the month, so there's going to be 2 PhD students who are presenting. It's Tobias Wiedmann from the EUI, who will present a paper titled "How Renewable Energy Divides Politics: The Impact of Wind Turbines on Moral, Emotional Language in Political Discourse." And Maaike Homan will give a talk on her work on emotion recognition. Then we have a couple of weeks of breaks because of school holidays and all sorts of Christian holidays. And then on May 21st, we will have Cameron Brick from the Psychology Department of the University of Amsterdam. And Cameron is an expert on climate change communication. So he will come and talk about that. So basically 2 talks about climate pretty soon. And then May 28th, there is again graduate students who are presenting. The first who we have lined up is Nora Schulten, who will give a to-be-announced talk. So
it's on the psychopathology of terrorists. And
excellent.
Yeah, and I think also Robin Tuchel will give a talk.
And that's probably again on environmental communication.
Yeah, it's climate month.
Climate month, yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing many of you back again in the near or distant future.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, audience, for coming and your questions.
You're welcome.